He's just a servant. My son-in-law sneered, his voice carrying enough contempt to make a few nearby guests glance our way. He didn't even try to lower his tone, as though my presence in a modest suit automatically placed me beneath their notice. He pointed at me like I was some nameless figure meant to serve champagne, not stand among the honored guests. A murmur rippled through the crowd, small nods, a few raised brows, until a voice from the back cut through the tension like a bell. I saw him in Forbes. The words hung in the air for a moment before the weight of them dropped. Heads turned, jaws slackened. My son-in-law froze the stem of his wine glass, trembling before slipping from his fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound as sharp as the shock etched across his face. But before I tell you how that moment unraveled, I need to take you back to where it all began. Nancy didn't knock. She never did when she was excited. She burst through the polished oak doors of my office like a gust of spring wind, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. I was in the middle of a tense conference call with our Tokyo partners, finalizing details of a $500 million acquisition that had taken months to negotiate. Yet the look on my daughter's face pulled me out of that corporate battlefield instantly. "Gentlemen, we'll continue this tomorrow," I said into the microphone, already reaching to disconnect the call. She practically skipped across the Persian rug toward my desk. "Dad, I'm engaged." Her voice rang with a giddy tremor as she thrust her left hand toward me. The diamond caught the golden afternoon light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, scattering tiny rainbows across my mahogany desk. My Mont Blanc pen stopped mid-click. "Engaged," I repeated, tasting the word as if it were foreign. My mind was still somewhere between Tokyo contracts and quarterly reports. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday," she said, her voice softening into a dreamy tone. "Rick proposed in Bryant Park during lunch. It was perfect, Dad. He even had a whole speech about our future together." She collapsed into the client chair across from me, her designer jeans and cream silk blouse, a soft contrast to the sharp lines of my office. I studied her carefully. Nancy had mentioned Rick here and there over the past 6 months, but our conversations about him were always fleeting, more hints than details. "Tell me about him again," I said slowly. "Rick Morrison?" she replied without hesitation. "He works in investment banking at Steinberg and Associates." Her fingers brushed the diamond absently, but her laugh, light, almost nervous, made me lean forward. "He's amazing, Dad. Ambitious, charming, everything I've ever wanted." There was a pause, just long enough for me to notice the flicker in her expression when she added, "And his family. They're lovely people." "Actually, that's why I'm here," she continued, twisting the ring round and round on her finger. "They've invited us to dinner tonight, 6 o'clock. Rick wants you to meet them properly." I rose and walked toward the window, looking down at Manhattan pulsing with life 47 floors below. Something in her tone, too light to rehearse, set off a quiet alarm in my mind. "What aren't you telling me, sweetheart?" I asked without turning around. Nancy's gaze shifted toward the floor, her voice suddenly still. She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any confession could. "It's just, could you maybe not mention the company or the Forbes articles?" Nancy's voice was careful, almost tiptoeing over the words. She kept her eyes on the diamond ring, twisting it around, as if the tiny movement could hide the unease in her request. "Rick's parents are very down to earth, and I don't want them to feel intimidated." There it was. The moment I'd been waiting for since she turned 18 and started dating, the inevitable request to dim the light, to shrink myself so others could feel taller. Hide the wealth, pretend to be ordinary. Let them judge us not for who we are, but for who we can pretend to be. "You want me to lie about who I am?" My tone was calm, but my gaze was steady, the kind that made board members stop mid-sentence. "Not lie exactly," she countered quickly, her voice edging into that pleading tone I hadn't heard since she was 12 and begging for a golden retriever puppy. "Just downplay things. Drive the Toyota instead of the Bentley. Wear something casual." I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. Her words didn't surprise me, they never did. But there was a sting in hearing my own daughter ask me to strip away the truth as though it were an inconvenience. "Nancy," I said, rising and walking to the mahogany desk drawer where I kept signed checks for emergencies. If this man truly loves you, shouldn't he accept every part of your life? She didn't flinch. He does love me, but first impressions matter. Rick's family values hard work and honesty. They might think I'm just some spoiled rich girl if they knew everything. The irony hit like a slow tide. She wanted them to see her honesty while laying the foundation on deception. I took out a check signed and dated and slid it across the desk. 50,000. Wedding expenses. Consider it an engagement gift. Her brows lifted in surprise but then softened. Dad, thank you. Where exactly are we having dinner? I asked, keeping my tone light, almost conversational, though my mind was already shifting into a different mode. 123 Kent Avenue, Brooklyn, she said without hesitation. Rick's family home. His parents, Tom and Mary Morrison. 6 o'clock sharp. She leaned over, kissed my forehead, and folded the check into her purse like a secret. Thank you for understanding, Dad. This means everything to me. When the door clicked shut behind her, the office seemed quieter, though the Tokyo call equipment still blinked on my desk, a silent reminder of the empire I had built from nothing. I glanced at the notepad with the Brooklyn address scrawled across it, the ink still fresh. Elizabeth's voice echoed in my mind, soft but steady character, reveals itself when people think nobody important is watching. Maybe tonight wouldn't just be dinner, maybe it would be a test. I loosened my tie, unbuttoned my jacket, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. My reflection merged with the Manhattan skyline, the same face that had graced Forbes covers, the same hands that once clutched $500, and a revolutionary AI algorithm at age 28. On my desk, Elizabeth's photograph, in its Tiffany silver frame, caught the last light of the day. She was smiling, her eyes asking me the same unspoken question she always had when my principles were challenged. What would you do? Do, my love, I whispered into the stillness of the empty office. My voice was barely audible, yet it seemed to hang in the air, caught between the humming servers and the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. I closed my eyes and the years peeled away like pages from an old book. I could see myself at 28, hunched over a flickering monitor in a cramped one-room office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale ambition. I had slept on a futon wedged against the wall, lived on dollar store ramen and written code until my hands ached and my vision blurred. And in the middle of those relentless nights, Elizabeth would arrive quietly, like a blessing, carrying a paper cup of coffee and a smile that made exhaustion feel like progress. She had believed in Nurok when venture capitalists smirked at my pitch decks and dismissed my ideas as fantasy. She would lean against my desk and say, "Money doesn't change who someone is, George. It just reveals it." That memory, her voice, her certainty followed me as I drove home. Park Avenue stretched ahead, dressed in its familiar elegance, but even the city's polished facade couldn't settle the storm churning in my chest. Nancy deserved happiness, yes, but she also deserved protection from those who might see her not as a woman, but as a trophy. Inside my 3,000 square foot sanctuary overlooking Central Park, I wandered instinctively toward the bedroom dresser. Elizabeth's jewelry box sat there, the wood polished to a soft glow. Inside, nestled in velvet, was her engagement ring, a modest solitaire I had saved 3 months to afford. She had loved it more than the flawless stones I could afford years later, because it represented a time when our love was measured in sacrifice, not carrots. Behind the Monet painting in the hallway was the wall safe. Inside were the artifacts of a life lived in love and loss, our wedding photos, Nancy's first crayon drawing of our family, and Elizabeth's final letter to me. My hand hovered over them, but today wasn't about sentiment. Today needed strategy. In the walk-in closet behind rows of handmade Italian suits hung a garment I had almost forgotten existed, a cheap, ill-fitting polyester suit from Target. I had bought it years ago for a charity event where executives dressed down to understand poverty. I had worn it once, hated every scratchy thread, but kept it as a reminder, and now it might serve a greater purpose. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. Rick Morrison's LinkedIn profile came up quickly: investment banking at a mid-tier firm, the kind that had respectable clients but not much prestige. His posts were a mix of business jargon and motivational cliches about synergy and strategic vision. Not terrible, not impressive, mostly safe. The Forbes article about me was easier still to find. There I was, tech visionary, George Hartwell, from startup to $2.3 billion empire, standing in my signature pose, Manhattan skyline behind me. The caption mentioned my philanthropic work, my late wife, and my years raising Nancy alone. If Rick had done even the bare minimum of research, he knew exactly who her father was. But had his family, I headed to the garage. The polished gleam of the Bentley, the quiet power of the Tesla, the sleek menace of the Porsche, all lined up like soldiers. And then in the far corner, looking like it was hiding from the others, sat my 2010 Toyota Camry. A car with 140,000 miles, its paint dulled by time, its steering wheel worn smooth. It was the embodiment of deliberate mediocrity. As I ran a hand over its hood, Elizabeth's voice returned to me, not just as a memory, but as if she were standing right beside me. George, the truth doesn't need to be announced. It shows itself when no one's looking. And tonight I intended to watch very closely indeed. The best way to know a person's heart is to watch how they treat someone they believe can do nothing for them. I'd learned that lesson early in life, back when my shoes had holes in them, and my biggest investment was a second-hand wrench set. But now that truth was more important than ever. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high garage windows, cutting the concrete floor into bands of light and shadow. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams like tiny particles of time. My phone chimed 4:30 p.m. The reminder I had set for myself appeared on screen time to become someone else entirely. My hand brushed over the cheap polyester of the Target suit, and the decision crystallized. After years wrapped in Italian wool and silk, the polyester clung uncomfortably, whispering against my skin in a language of neglect. Its faint chemical scent had outlasted a decade in storage. I'd found it shoved deep behind tuxedos and tailored jackets, the original price tag still dangling from one sleeve like a forgotten insult. The last and only time I'd worn it had been for a charity gala, where wealthy executives dressed down to experience poverty for a few staged hours. I'd hated every second of that polyester prison, but now it felt like armor. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, methodically dismantling George Hartwell, billionaire, tech visionary. First to go was the Patek Philippe from my wrist, its weight and quiet ticking replaced by a $25 Casio with a scratch face and a plastic band faded from sun and sweat. It was still set to the wrong time zone. My Hermes briefcase was traded for a stained canvas messenger bag I'd borrowed from one of the building's maintenance staff. The iPhone 15 Pro Max went into the wall safe alongside platinum cards, family photos, and Elizabeth's letters. In its place, I slid a battered Samsung Galaxy A5 into my pocket, the battery already limping toward zero. I hunched my shoulders, slightly shortened my stride, and lowered my voice, practicing the blue-collar cadence I'd heard from plumbers, electricians, and delivery men in the building. I stared at my reflection until the posture, the tone, the presence all felt natural. George Hartwell, retired plumber, I murmured to myself. Modest pension, proud of my daughter's success. Elizabeth's jewelry box sat silently on the dresser, its presence like a witness in a courtroom. I imagined her eyes following my every movement as I removed the last platinum credit card from my wallet, leaving only a scuffed debit card and $47 in worn bills. My walk-in closet, larger than most apartments in Manhattan, suddenly seemed obscene. Rows of polished shoes, hand-stitched suits, and watches worth more than some people's homes lined the walls, each piece a trophy of a life built through sweat and sacrifice. But none of them, not the cars, not the penthouse, not the art, could protect Nancy if she was about to make a terrible mistake. The elevator doors slid open to the garage level with their usual quiet efficiency. Marcus, the 60-year-old concierge who had served this building longer than some residents had been alive, stood near the delivery station, clipboard in hand. His years of service had taught him the art of seeing without seeing. When he spotted me, his eyes flickered in something like surprise, before his professionalism swallowed it whole. "Good evening, Mr. Hartwell," he said evenly, though I caught the faintest question in his tone. "Evening, Marcus," I replied. "Will you be needing the Bentley tonight or the Tesla?" His glance slid to the row of luxury machines gleaming under the overhead lights. "Actually," I pulled the Toyota Camry's key from my pocket, letting it dangle between two fingers. Marcus's face didn't move, but I noticed the infinitesimal pause, like a man catching himself before asking why. "Of course, sir," he said finally. "Shall I warm it up for you?" "That's not necessary." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "And Marcus, if anyone asks, you didn't see me leaving anything unusual tonight?" He gave a slow, solemn nod. "I rarely see anything unusual, Mr. Hartwell. Have a pleasant evening." The Camry sat tucked in the far corner of the garage like a shy cousin hiding from a family portrait. Its silver paint was dulled by time, the steering wheel worn smooth by years of hands. As I slid inside, the faint scent of vanilla air freshener mixed with the musk of aged leather. Compared to the seamless hush of the Bentley or the quiet power of the Porsche, this car felt honest. The AM/FM radio crackled to life when I turned the key, spitting out a classic rock riff instead of the curated playlists I usually streamed over satellite. I rested my hands on the wheel for a moment, feeling the weight of the life I was about to step into, one I had once lived, one I had fought to leave behind, and one I now needed to wear like a second skin. Tonight I wouldn't be George Hartwell, billionaire. Tonight I'd be the man who could see the truth without anyone knowing he was watching. I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught my reflection again. The haircut still betrayed its pedigree, the precise work of a Manhattan stylist who charged more than some people's rent, but everything else about me now spoke of a different world. The polyester suit, the scuffed shoes, the worn canvas bag on the passenger seat, they all screamed ordinary middle-class American. I could almost feel the weight of their camouflage. This was the man Rick Morrison's family would meet, a man they might either welcome without suspicion or dismiss without hesitation. The GPS, with its flat mechanical certainty, broke the silence. "Proceed to 123 Kent Avenue, Brooklyn. Estimated travel time 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That was all it would take to cross not just boroughs but entire social worlds. My fingers tightened on the Camry's steering wheel. It was worn smooth from years of service, a far cry from the buttery leather of my Bentley or Porsche. As I pulled out of the garage, Park Avenue slipped away behind me, its towers of glass and steel sinking into shadow. Somewhere in that darkness, I was leaving George Hartwell, billionaire, philanthropist, tech visionary, behind. Ahead through the Holland Tunnel waited George Hartwell, retired plumber, widower, father of a soon-to-be bride. This wasn't a performance for business gain, nor for vanity. It was for the one thing in my life that truly mattered: Nancy's future happiness. She trusted Rick Morrison enough to promise him forever. Tonight I would find out if that trust had been placed wisely or dangerously. The radio crackled with a classic rock station, its sound grainy and imperfect. Behind me, the Manhattan skyline became a fading silhouette in the rearview mirror. Ahead, the tunnel's orange light swept past in hypnotic rhythm, pulling me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The Camry's engine ticked quietly as I slid into a parking spot wedged between a Tesla Model S and a BMW X5, two modern symbols of success. My own car, with its vanilla air freshener and faint scent of time, felt invisible among them. 123 Kent Avenue stood just as I'd imagined, a renovated Williamsburg townhouse that strained to look effortless. Fresh paint on the steps hinted at recent work, a DIY project that was almost straight but not quite. The imperfections were telling. I checked the slip of crumpled paper in my jacket pocket one last time, 6:00 p.m. sharp. The cheap Casio on my wrist read exactly that. I pressed the doorbell. It chimed with a sound far too refined for the slightly crooked way it was mounted. Footsteps approached. The door swung open to reveal a man whose identity was unmistakable: Rick Morrison. "You must be Nancy's father," he said, his smile the kind that looked good in a LinkedIn headshot, but didn't quite reach the eyes. "Rick Morrison. Pleasure to meet you." His handshake was firm but short. As our palms separated, I caught the subtle motion, him wiping his hand on his pants. The shirt he wore was perhaps $200 expensive enough to impress, but not designer. It tried hard to project success without revealing the effort behind it. "George Hartwell," I said, keeping my tone modest and tinged with the blue-collar accent I'd practiced. "Thanks for having me over. Come in, come in. Nancy's been telling us wonderful things about you." The interior hit me the second I stepped inside. New furniture that still carried the faint chemical scent of recent delivery. Decor arranged with catalog precision, but without the personal touch of objects that had been lived with for years. And in the living room, the centerpiece, a massive flat-screen TV commanding the space like a shrine to material ambition. Rick turned toward the kitchen. "Mom, Dad, this is George. And as his words hung in the air, I braced myself for the real beginning of the evening, the unspoken tests, the casual questions, the tiny tells that would reveal exactly who these people were when they thought they were looking at a man who couldn't help them. Rick's voice drifted toward the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone used to being heard. Moments later, Mary Morrison appeared, moving as if on a stage she'd rehearsed for. She wiped her hands on an apron with a little too much precision, like even this small gesture was part of the performance. Her eyes swept over me. Target suit, scuffed shoes, canvas messenger bag in a glance so quick it could have been mistaken for polite curiosity. But I caught it. 3 seconds, maybe less, to sum up my worth. The smile that followed curved her lips, but her eyes stayed cool. "How lovely to meet you, George," she said, voice sweet, but carrying that faint metallic edge that always makes you wonder if there's something sharper underneath. "GPS got me here just fine, ma'am," I replied, softening my vowels just enough to sound unpolished. "Beautiful neighborhood you've got here." "Well," she said, lifting her chin slightly, "it's certainly up and coming." Her tone implied that the coming part was thanks in no small measure to her own presence. Tom Morrison emerged from the living room, the muted TV still humming faintly behind him. He gave me a nod, polite, perfunctory, and utterly without warmth, before his gaze shifted entirely to Nancy, who stepped into view from the kitchen. "Nancy, sweetheart," he said, his voice instantly warmer, "you look radiant. Engagement suits you." I watched them, taking it all in. It was like watching a well-practiced family tableau, each person slipping into their role with seamless ease. Tom dressed in expensive casual clothes that looked like he'd bought them specifically for company. Mary adorned with costume jewelry so well chosen, it almost passed for something inherited. Rick faintly shimmering in cologne, just strong enough to mark territory without quite choking the air. "Please sit down," Mary said, gesturing with hostess-like grace toward a chair. Not just any chair, the one with the slightly wobbly leg, the kind that made guests shift uncomfortably without knowing why. I eased into it, feeling the unevenness beneath me. The living room's decor told me everything I needed to know. Books on the shelves, but their spines had a uniform layer of dust-proof they'd never been opened. Generic household items were tucked halfway out of sight, strategically hidden behind carefully placed name-brand products. The whole place felt like a stage set built to impress with no true history behind it. "So George," Rick said, settling into the largest armchair, like a king reclaiming his throne, "Nancy tells me you're retired. What line of work were you in?" "Plumbing." "Mostly," I said, shifting just enough to make the chair wobble. "Did some contracting work too." "Honest work, you know." Rick's eyes shifted in the smallest way, like a man ticking off a box in his mental hierarchy. "Ah, skilled trades. Very practical." The word practical came out perfectly measured, harmless on the surface, but with a subtle note of condescension that settled in the air like cigarette smoke. "I hear you work in investment banking," I asked, letting the word investment come out just slightly wrong, as if I'd only heard it in passing. "That's right. Steinberg and Associates," he said, his voice adopting the slow, deliberate tone of someone explaining something to a child. "We handle portfolio optimization for high net worth individuals. Complex financial instruments, merger facilitation, that sort of thing." I nodded like he'd just given me a lecture on quantum physics. "Sounds real important." Nancy shifted on the couch, her smile a little too tight. "Dad's always been great with numbers too, haven't you, Dad?" I chuckled, letting it land self-deprecatingly. "Well, I can balance my own checkbook." That earned me one of those shared looks, the kind people think are subtle but speak volumes. Tom's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. Mary's lips pressed together, the faintest shadow of satisfaction passing over her face. "Dinner should be ready shortly," Mary announced, rising with that same smooth hostess grace. "I hope you like pot roast, George. It's a family recipe." "Sounds wonderful, ma'am," I said, leaning into my role. "I appreciate the hospitality." Inside, though, I could already feel the layers of this evening tightening around me like threads in a net. As we stepped toward the dining room, I caught a fleeting image in the reflection of the darkened window: Rick's smirk. It wasn't an open grin, just the faint upturn of a man convinced he'd already secured the upper hand. He thought the hierarchy was settled, and in a way he was right. The only detail he'd gotten wrong was which side of that hierarchy he truly occupied. "George, you'll sit here." Mary directed, her tone firm, but coated in the sugar of polite hospitality. She gestured toward a chair that wobbled the instant I settled into it, the legs shifting like it had been waiting for the perfect moment to betray its guest. The dining room was the rest of the house in miniature, an aesthetic stitched together from catalogs and store displays. The china on the table looked like it wanted to be a set, but had clearly been collected over decades, piece by piece. The silverware gleamed, but its mismatched styles told their own quiet story. Wine glasses, the kind you'd expect to see holding a fine vintage, were now half filled with tap water in an effort at sophistication. The centerpiece dominated the table, an intricate spray of artificial flowers, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on a mirrored tray. From a distance, it looked expensive. Up close, you could still smell the faint tang of craft store glue. Even the dimmed lighting seemed to serve less as mood setting and more as a way to blur the synthetic edges of the scene. "This looks incredible, Mrs. Morrison," I said, my voice carrying the exact tone of a man humbled by another's effort. "Oh, it's nothing fancy," Mary replied, waving a dismissive hand, though her eyes shone with satisfaction. "Just a simple family meal." Rick, playing the role of sommelier, uncorked a wine bottle like he was revealing a rare artifact. "A 2019 Cabernet from Sonoma County," he announced with deliberate clarity. "Excellent vintage, very well regarded in wine circles." The statement was aimed squarely at me, as though I'd never heard of California wine, much less tasted a bottle worth more than my car, at least in his mind. "Sounds expensive," I said mildly, watching the dark red liquid swirl into the glasses. "Well," Rick replied with a knowing smile when you know what to look for. Tom lifted his glass the moment choreographed. To Rick and Nancy's future together, and to families coming together despite different backgrounds. His emphasis on different carried the weight of a subtle warning. Nancy's cheeks flushed as she lifted her glass. I did the same, the wobbly chair creaking under me. So George Rick began cutting into his roast with the precision of a surgeon. "Retirement must be nice. No more crawling under sinks, am I right? Had my share of tight spaces, that's for sure," I said, spearing a piece of roast with deliberate casualness. I picked up the wrong fork for my salad just to watch his eyes flicker. "But honest work's honest work." "Absolutely," Rick agreed, the word polished smooth with condescension. "Physical labor does have its dignity. Of course, in my field, we focus more on leveraging intellectual capital. Just last week, I facilitated a merger worth $50,000 to our firm." I nodded with what I hoped looked like admiration, though inside I thought about how that sum wouldn't cover the wine cellar maintenance in my real life. "That's real impressive," I offered. Mary beamed. "Rick has such wonderful connections. He dines at Leonardo regularly with clients." She said it like she was dropping the name of royalty. The irony was sharp. I could have bought a table at Leonardo for a year without blinking. Tom turned to my daughter. "Nancy tells us you're quite the accomplished young woman. Graphic design, very creative field." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." "I love what I do," she replied. "Of course, once you're married, priorities change," Mary added with the smooth authority of someone who already saw the future mapped out. "Rick will provide well. You might not need to work at all." Nancy's fork froze midair, the hesitation almost imperceptible. "I enjoy my career," she said, her tone polite but edged. "Well, naturally, dear," Mary said, smiling in a way that wasn't really a smile, "but there are different kinds of fulfillment." Rick leaned back slightly, his eyes glinting with a smug sort of wisdom that came from a life of believing he had all the answers. "Rick understands what it takes to maintain a proper lifestyle," Mary said proudly, as though she were presenting him for auction. Rick nodded in solemn agreement. "Financial planning is crucial," he declared, swirling his wine in a way that suggested he'd practiced it in the mirror. "Generational wealth doesn't build itself." He let his gaze slide to me, his smirk just shy of polite. "I imagine that's not something your family has much experience with, George." I smiled mildly, keeping my tone easy. "Can't say it is," I replied, though I bit back the urge to mention that my portfolio could buy his entire neighborhood twice over, with enough left to pick up a vineyard for fun. "That's why Nancy's so fortunate," Rick continued, glancing toward her with the air of a man bestowing a blessing. "She'll never have to worry about limitations again." The word limitations seemed to land on my daughter like a physical weight. Her expression shifted in a slow, painful sequence. First confusion, then hurt, and finally a flicker of recognition, as if she were beginning to see the bars of a cage she hadn't realized she'd stepped into. More roast George. Mary interrupted, her voice bright but strained. She was clearly uncomfortable with the tension she herself had helped weave into the air. This is delicious, ma'am, I said, honestly setting my fork down for emphasis. You're a wonderful cook. The compliment seemed to throw her slightly off balance, but she recovered quickly, sitting up straighter. Well, I do try to keep things nice. She glanced around the dining room, mismatched china pretending to be a set silverware from different decades, the craft store centerpiece, and her eyes shone with pride. We believe presentation matters. Rick's shown me photos of the places he takes clients. Tom added, his voice tinged with admiration. Very upscale establishments, the kind of places where they know quality. Rick absorbed the praise like sunlight, his smile tightening into something almost theatrical. Image is everything in my business, hon, he said. Clients need to see success to believe in your abilities. Makes sense. I nodded, my voice steady. Trust is important. Exactly, he replied, leaning forward as if delivering a private truth. Though I suppose in your line of work, George, the clientele wasn't quite as discerning. I noticed my daughter's knuckles tightening around her fork, her grip turning white. Rick, she started, but he cut in smoothly. I'm just saying different worlds require different skill sets. His smile was sharp now, every tooth on display. Nancy's moving up in the world. The phrase hung in the air like an insult wearing a polite disguise. Even Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward his son. Coffee in the living room, Mary said quickly, rising with her hostess smile firmly in place. Sounds perfect, Rick agreed, pushing back his chair and tugging at his shirt cuffs as though he were on stage. Dad, didn't you want to show George your Cadillac photos? Tom's face lit up. Oh yes, wait until you see this beauty, George. 15 years old but pristine condition. Real luxury automobile. How, Autumn? As we moved toward the living room, I caught Nancy's expression, a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and something deeper. A dawning awareness. It was the kind of look that told me the performance at this dinner table had done more than just bruise her pride. It had cracked the illusion. The evening had wound itself down to that quiet point where conversation slows and coffee cups grow cold. But I knew the real test of the night was still ahead. On the coffee table before us lay Tom's photo album, open with a certain ceremony, as though we were about to witness a treasured family heirloom. This, Tom declared, resting a proud hand on the page, is my pride and joy. The photograph in question was of a 15-year-old Cadillac, polished to a mirror shine under the kind of lighting you only see in dealership ads. He leaned forward, the excitement in his voice growing with each detail he recalled. Leather seats, premium sound system, all the luxury features you could get back then. Oh, she's a beauty. He flipped through the album slowly, each page featuring another angle, close-ups of the dashboard, the hood ornament, even the trunk. He described them with the reverence of someone showing off a rare artifact, completely unaware that most of those luxury features were now standard in economy cars. Very nice vehicle, I said diplomatically, keeping my tone warm. Cost me $35,000 when it was new, Tom said, puffing up slightly. Of course, that was real money back then. Rick had settled into his usual chair posture, confident smile, easy, a man perfectly at home, in a room where he controlled the conversation. George, he began, his voice slow and deliberate. I want you to know I take my responsibilities seriously. Nancy will never want for anything. His tone had the weight of a royal proclamation, as though I should be grateful he was bestowing such assurances. I understand her background might make this transition challenging, he went on the pause before transition, doing all the work of an insult, but I'm committed to elevating her lifestyle appropriately. Across the room, I heard it, the sharp intake of breath from my daughter. It cut through the air like the first crack in a frozen lake. Rick either didn't notice or didn't care. I'll make sure she has access to the right social circles, the proper cultural experiences, he continued, casually glancing at her, as though explaining a long-term improvement plan for a fixer-upper property. Someone from her background couldn't be expected to navigate these waters alone. That was it. I saw it happen, the change in her face. The love-struck optimism that had carried her through the evening faltered, crumbling to reveal something raw and unguarded underneath. The words had landed exactly where he hadn't expected them to, not as reassurance, but as revelation. "We should go," she said quietly, rising so abruptly her chair scraped against the hardwood. "Oh, leaving so soon," Mary's voice rose in genuine disappointment. "I was hoping we'd have more time to get acquainted." I stood more slowly, the legs of my chair groaning in protest, the sound loud in the suddenly strained silence. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Morrison," I said, meaning it. Everything was delicious. The goodbyes were perfunctory, practiced the kind of politeness that masks relief. No one reached for our coats. No one made the usual half-hearted protest to stay a little longer. Rick didn't even walk us to the door, a small gesture in most circles. But in my book, the ultimate disrespect. Nancy went straight to the coat closet, retrieving her light sweater without a word. My cheap jacket hung there alone on the expensive rack, limp and out of place, like a surrendered flag among banners of victory. When we stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, carrying the ordinary sounds of Brooklyn life couples, walking their dogs, clinking glasses from outdoor restaurant patios, the steady hum of traffic in the distance. Our Toyota sat parked under a streetlight, looking even more worn and out of place against the neighborhood's carefully curated SUVs and European sedans. I took a breath. "Nancy," I began softly. "Don't," she said, her voice tight, the single word closing the conversation before it could even begin. Her voice came out tight, stretched thin over the raw edges of emotion she was barely holding back. "Just don't start." She stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, turning toward me with a sharpness that made the street lamp above us catch the glint of unshed tears in her eyes. "Did you hear the way he talked about you, about us?" Before I could answer, she whirled fully around, her hair swinging with the motion, and the first tear finally broke free. "He loves me, Dad. They're protective of their family." "Protective?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm, even as I felt rage coil tighter and tighter in my chest. "Sweetheart, that man just spent 2 hours explaining how inadequate your father is and how lucky you are to escape your background. You don't understand." The words burst from her like a dam breaking sharp and loud in the quiet street. "This is exactly what I was afraid of, you judging them judging us, nobody actually giving anyone a real chance." "I gave them a chance," I said evenly, though my voice trembled under the surface. "I sat there for 2 hours while they insulted everything about who we are." "Who we are?" She let out a laugh, bitter and hollow. "Dad, you drove here in a 20-year-old car wearing a Target suit. That's not who we are." The irony struck me like a punch to the ribs. "No, it's not," I admitted. "But Rick doesn't know that. And look how he treated me anyway." "He was nervous," she shot back quickly. "Meeting parents is stressful." "Nancy, listen to yourself," I said, stepping closer. "You're making excuses for a man who just told an entire dinner table that you're moving up in the world by marrying him." "Maybe I am." Her voice wavered now, the steel softening into something fragile. "Maybe this is my chance to build something better." I felt the words before I said them, like a weight pressing on my chest. "Better than what? Better than me?" The question hung in the air between us like a blade suspended by a thread. Her face crumpled, pain breaking through, but her voice still carried defiance. "Better than hiding who I am because you think money corrupts everyone. Better than pretending to be something I'm not because you can't trust me to make my own decisions?" "This isn't about trust, sweetheart," I said quietly. "This is about character. His character. No, Dad." She shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "This is about control. You can't stand that I chose someone you didn't pick. You can't stand that I might love someone who doesn't worship at the altar of your approval." She was breathing harder now, the emotion shaking through her voice. "I'm 28 years old. I'm not your little girl anymore. And Rick is not some gold digger you need to test and approve." I stared at her, searching for some trace of the little girl who used to hold my hand crossing the street. "If you marry him," I said, my voice low but steady, "you'll spend the rest of your life apologizing for who you used to be." "And if I don't," she countered, her voice cracking, "I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I gave up my happiness just to make you feel better about being alone." The words landed with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath from me. Her hand flew to her mouth, instantly, eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't mean that." But we both knew she had. "If you can't support my decision," she said, her voice almost breaking entirely, "then maybe you shouldn't come to the wedding. And before I could answer, she turned and ran up the front steps, her footsteps echoing sharply against the concrete. The front door closed behind her with a final hollow sound, the kind of sound you feel in your bones. I stood there alone under the streetlight, the cold air pressing against my skin, my old Toyota parked at the curb like an unwanted witness. When I finally slid into the driver's seat, the car seemed smaller than before, the silence heavier. My hand stayed on the wheel unmoving as I sat there replaying every word, knowing the night had changed more than just her view of me. It had shifted something permanent between us. The Toyota's cabin smelled faintly of coffee and motor oil. The remnants of 100 work days lived on the road. The worn cloth seats sagged in places where years of use had molded them to my frame. The basic factory radio stared back at me, its red digital numbers glowing faintly, a reminder that tonight I had been performing. The scattered work receipts on the dashboard, crumpled stained, were more than just scraps of paper. They were props in a role I'd chosen for myself, a disguise meant to expose truth. Only the truth I'd unearthed cut deeper than I'd prepared for. The dashboard clock read 9:15 p.m. The so-called test was over. But tests end with grades, not with the kind of consequences waiting for me now. I turned the key. The Toyota's engine coughed to life with its familiar rough idle, a sharp, almost mocking contrast to the low velvety purr of my Bentley parked safely in its reserved space in the Park Avenue garage, as far from this reality as possible. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching sight of my own reflection. Still George the plumber. Still wearing the slightly frayed Target suit jacket and scuffed shoes. Still keeping up the act that had stripped away more layers than I'd intended. Pulling slowly from the curb, I glanced through the passenger side window at the Morrison house one last time. The golden light spilling from their picture windows looked warm, but I could almost hear the low hum of conversation inside postmortem dissection of the evening. They'd be weighing my worth, filing me away under Nancy's father, the working class one. Williamsburg's gentrified streets unfolded before me like a film reel I'd seen too many times. Boutique wine shops, artisanal coffee houses, sleek bistros charging $30 for entrees Rick probably bragged about. Every block felt like another reminder of the gap between their curated reality and mine, or rather the one I'd chosen to show them. The Williamsburg Bridge loomed ahead, its steel ribs glowing against the night. Traffic thickened at the approach. Stop. Lurch forward. Stop again. The rhythm matched the restless churn in my head. Around me, luxury sedans and spotless SUVs ferried their owners back to lives without question marks, while I sat there in my deliberate disguise, replaying every word Nancy and I had exchanged. Halfway across, I pulled into the legal viewpoint, a small slice of space where the city opened up in both directions. I let the engine idle its uneven hum, blending with the low roar of traffic passing overhead. The East River stretched below, black in silver, Manhattan's skyline mirrored in fractured diamonds across the water. It was a view that had once been a promise to me. Years ago, when Elizabeth was alive, I used to drive her here in my real beat-up car. We'd sit for hours, windows down, watching the lights and whispering about the life we were going to build. Back then, the dream was survival and hope in equal measure. I reached up and flipped down the sun visor. The small silver frame was still there, tucked neatly into the band, exactly where it had been in every car I'd owned since the night she died. Elizabeth's smile, open, patient, knowing, met mine. She hates me right now, I said, my voice barely audible over the whoosh of passing trucks. Our daughter thinks I'm a controlling bastard who can't stand to see her happy. In the quiet that followed, I could almost hear Elizabeth's voice, clear, calm, the way it used to cut through my worst days. Give her time, George. A lump formed in my throat. Love doesn't vanish overnight. Even when it's hurt, it's still there, waiting for the chance to be mended. I let the words sit in the air, staring at the city that had been both battlefield and reward. Somewhere out there, Nancy was making her choices. And somewhere deep down, I knew my next choice would decide whether I lost her for a season or forever. But what if she was wrong? The thought hit me like a sudden drop in temperature. What if I was wrong? What if I'd gone too far tonight, pushed too hard too fast? What if exposing Rick's character so bluntly had backed Nancy into a corner, leaving her no choice but to pick a side? And she picked his. I couldn't stop replaying the moment she ran back toward that house. That look in her eyes. It hadn't just been anger I could handle. I'd seen plenty of anger in my life, and most of it burned out in time. No, this was different. It was disappointment. In me. The car was silent except for the low grumble of the Toyota's engine until the radio crackled to life static, giving way to the faint strains of a familiar melody. It took me only a second to recognize it. Our wedding song. Elizabeth had insisted on this cheesy romantic ballad all those years ago, grinning like a kid when the opening notes played. I'd pretended to hate it, rolling my eyes at how sappy it was, but secretly I loved it. Loved the way it lit up her face, the way her laugh got caught in the melody. Now hearing it again, the sound cut through me like glass. I couldn't tell if it was a message from somewhere beyond or just a cruel random coincidence. My hand reached out almost on its own, turning the volume up, and suddenly I wasn't in the Toyota anymore. I was back in our tiny first apartment, the one with the drafty windows and a kitchen barely big enough for two people to stand in. Elizabeth was in her simple wedding dress, twirling barefoot on the worn linoleum floor, insisting we practice our first dance even though we couldn't afford lessons. Character shows when people think nobody important is watching. She'd said that night, laughing when I stepped on her toes for the fifth time. I smiled faintly at the memory, but the truth underneath it stung. Tonight Rick Morrison had shown his character with crystal clarity. Unfortunately, so had I. The song faded out, replaced by the cold, practical voice of a traffic reporter, then a burst of commercials trying to sell me things I didn't need. I shifted the car into drive and eased back into the flow toward Manhattan, the streetlights sweeping over the windshield in rhythmic flashes. We rolled through lower Manhattan, past candlelit restaurants where couples lingered over dessert, past galleries where Elizabeth and I used to browse on lazy Sunday afternoons. Back then, money was tight, but the dreams were endless. Now I had more than enough money, but some dreams were gone forever. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had just spent an entire evening being looked down upon by people who couldn't afford a single month of my parking garage fees, and yet here I was, the one feeling like an outsider. By the time I turned onto Park Avenue, the exhaustion hit. Not just the physical kind, but the deep, soul-heavy fatigue that comes from holding up a mask too long. Tonight I'd worn it for hours, sitting there while my daughter defended a man who had spent the evening quietly, skillfully insulting everything about her roots. Watching her choose loyalty to Rick over respect for her father felt like taking a punch I didn't see coming. I pulled into the garage. The attendant stepped forward, mid-50s, always neat, always professional. He knew exactly who I was, of course, but like any good New Yorker with self-respect, he never let on. "Good evening, Mr. Hartwell," he said simply, as if billionaires regularly rolled in, driving 15-year-old Toyotas dressed in Target suits. I nodded, handed him the keys, and stepped into the elevator. The ride to the penthouse felt longer than usual, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of me that didn't belong up there. George the plumber was still staring back at me, the man who'd walked into the Morrison house tonight. Somewhere between the lobby and the top floor, I knew I'd have to let him go. But for now, I let him ride with me all the way home. The costume had done its job. It had let me step into another life for just long enough to expose a truth I could never unsee. But now, as I slid my key into the penthouse door, I realized the damage to my relationship with Nancy might be permanent, an invisible fracture running too deep to ever heal. The click of the lock echoed in the stillness, and I stepped into the familiar silence of my real world. The air scented faintly of polished wood and expensive solitude. But I was still wearing the clothes of a lie, a cheap, wrinkled polyester suit that had revealed an unbearable truth. It clung to my skin like a damp shroud. The fabric seemed to itch with every step I took toward the bedroom. When I finally stripped it off piece by piece, I could feel the weight of the evening falling to the floor, with each item the knockoff watch that pinched my wrist, the fraying messenger bag with its worn strap, the scuffed shoes that had carried me into that dinner like a Trojan horse. Each object felt like evidence in a case I didn't want to prosecute, a case against myself. The next 3 weeks blurred together. The world kept moving even if I didn't. Board meetings convened in sleek conference rooms with perfect coffee and perfect lies. Acquisition deals advanced like clockwork. The Nurek empire hummed along at its usual precision, but my mind wasn't in any of it. My body was there, nodding in the right places, signing what needed signing, but my heart stayed somewhere else entirely. Mark, my assistant, noticed first. "Sir, the Henderson merger documents need your review," he'd say, then wait in patient silence while I sat at my desk staring out at Central Park. The spring foliage was lush and green, but all I could see was Nancy's face hard-closed, unreadable. Starting May 18th, I made it my mission to reach her. Every day without fail, I called 3 times morning, noon, and evening. Each time the call went straight to voicemail, the cold efficiency of a blocked number. At first, my messages were measured. "Nancy, sweetheart, please call me back. We need to talk about what happened." Then they became more pleading. "I know you're angry, but I love you. That hasn't changed." Finally, they were little more than whispers into the void. "I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." On May 20th, I tried a different approach, 3 dozen white roses, her favorite, since she was a little girl. I pictured her face lighting up the way it used to when I surprised her after school with a single stem. Instead, the flowers came back to the shop 2 days later, tagged with an impersonal delivery refused. The handwritten note I'd included on my personal stationery in my own careful script came back unopened. That hurt more than I expected. Desperation has a way of eroding dignity. By the end of that week, I found myself doing something I'd once sworn I'd never do, checking her Instagram. She'd never made it private, probably never imagining her father would resort to social media surveillance. Her posts were a perfectly curated chronicle of joy, wedding dress, fittings, venue, tastings, bridal shower snapshots with friends I'd watched grow up. Rick was in nearly every frame, his hand claiming her waist, his smile smug and sure. There was no sign of me, not in the captions, not in the photos. It was as if I had been neatly surgically cut out of her wedding narrative. One afternoon in late May, I called Mark into my office. My voice was flat when I spoke. "I need you to research something for me." Discreetly, he gave the same professional nod he'd been giving me for 20 years. "Of course, sir. The Plaza Hotel, June 5th. There's a wedding reception. I need to know the details." For the briefest moment, I saw his eyebrow twitch upward, but Mark was too good at his job to ask questions. By that evening, he had a neatly compiled report on my desk. Morrison Hartwell wedding, 200 guests, afternoon ceremony in the Oak Room, evening reception in the Grand Ballroom, estimated total cost $150,000. Rick's contribution, $50,000 cash, plus $100,000 in credit obligations. The financial details confirmed what I'd already suspected. Rick was building a wedding on borrowed money, constructing a grand illusion to impress people whose respect he hadn't earned and couldn't afford. And Nancy, my Nancy, was about to step right into that illusion wearing white. "One more thing, Mark. Get me Bill Patterson's direct number at the Plaza. We did that charity event there last year." Mark glanced up from his tablet. "The Children's Hospital benefit. That's the one." Shopping for wedding attire felt almost dreamlike, as if I were moving through someone else's life. At Bergdorf's, I ran my fingers over racks of fine fabrics, cashmere, silk, worsted wool, until I found the perfect charcoal Armani suit. The tailoring alone spoke of quiet authority. I paired it with an Italian silk tie, understated but impossibly refined, and completed the ensemble with a brand new Patek Philippe watch, an heirloom in the making, the kind of timepiece that signaled old money to anyone who knew what they were looking at. No more disguises, no more pretending to be less than I was. Nancy's Instagram remained a steady drip of cheerful updates all week. A bachelorette dinner in an upscale restaurant, her cheeks flushed from champagne. A final dress fitting where she stood in a pool of ivory fabric, smiling like a girl who had never known disappointment. Manicures with her bridal party hands held up in unison. For the camera, the captions full of inside jokes I would never understand. Each post was another clean, precise cut. My daughter had built a picture-perfect world, one where I simply didn't exist. On the night of June 4th, I poured myself a glass of 30-year-old scotch and carried it into my study. Elizabeth's photo was waiting on my desk, her eyes still alive with the warmth and conviction that had once been the foundation of our family. "She doesn't want me there," I told her image quietly. "She's made that clear." But her smile, damn that smile, seemed to say exactly what she'd always said. Sometimes love means showing up even when you're not wanted. The alarm dragged me out of sleep at 7:00 a.m. June 5th of wedding day. Sunlight streamed over Central Park in that rare golden way that photographers pray for. It was exactly the kind of day Nancy had always dreamed of for her wedding. I showered, shaved, and dressed with the precision of a general before battle. The Armani suit slid over my shoulders like it had been cut from my own shadow. The Patek Philippe caught the light like a promise. My Italian leather shoes mirrored the white veins of the marble floor. In the mirror, George Hartwell stared back, the George Hartwell the world knew. Successful, powerful, unyielding. The kind of man who didn't take no from anyone, least of all his own daughter. A series of Instagram notifications buzzed on my phone. Nancy's latest post was a wedding morning snapshot, her in a silk robe, hair in soft waves, bridesmaids around her like a chorus of joy champagne glasses, catching the morning light. I picked up the phone and called Bill Patterson. "George," he said warmly, "congratulations on Nancy's big day. I assume you'll be needing our VIP service." "Actually, Bill," I said, my voice steady, "I need a different kind of favor." The black Mercedes S-Class limousine slid to the curb at the plaza's Fifth Avenue entrance with silent elegance. My chauffeur, immaculate in his white gloves and pressed uniform, opened the door with the kind of deference that came from long habit. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, I felt the weight and certainty of my authentic self. The $5,000 Armani suit moved with me like armor. The Patek Philippe winked at the morning sun. The Italian leather shoes threw back the reflection of the plaza's legendary marble facade. Today there would be no hiding. The transformation was complete. No more plumber's overalls. No more ill-fitting polyester from the Target clearance rack. Today every stitch, every polished surface, every subtle gleam declared exactly who I was. This was George Hartwell as the world knew him. Billionaire tech mogul. The man whose face had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune. The man whose name could shift stock prices with a single comment. A man accustomed to walking into any room and knowing without question that he belonged. Outside the plaza, the air hummed with the quiet theater of high society. Luxury sedans and SUVs rolled up in stately procession, sleek BMWs, spotless Lexuses, the occasional gleaming Tesla. Women stepped out in flowing designer gowns, hairstyled to perfection, jewels, catching the morning light like flashes of lightning. Men straightened tailored lapels, smooth silk ties, and adjusted cufflinks that cost more than some people's monthly rent. It was the kind of carefully orchestrated display meant to project success, but I could tell in an instant who truly possessed it, and who was merely borrowing the costume. No one here carried themselves with the quiet certainty that comes from real wealth, the kind built over decades, not borrowed for the weekend on a line of credit. And no one, I told myself, had more right to be here than I did. Through the glass doors, the iconic palm court unfolded like a scene from an oil painting. Towering palm fronds framed glittering crystal chandeliers, each prism scattering the sunlight into a rain of gold. The scent of polished wood, fresh flowers, and luxury tea leaves lingered in the air. It was the kind of place where afternoon tea for two cost more than a week's paycheck for most. A string quartet played in the lobby, each note precise and deliberate, wrapping the space in elegance. Photographers, discreet but ever-present, captured every arrival for Nancy's wedding album. And then around the marble column, I saw at the security checkpoint. A well-dressed guard stood at a sleek podium, iPad in hand, his posture polite but unmistakably firm. "Good afternoon, sir. Name, please." "George Hartwell." I said, my voice even. His finger scrolled down the digital list. Paused. Scrolled again. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't see that name on our registry." I let the silence hang for a beat. There must be some mistake. I'm the bride's father. His expression softened, and for a second I thought he might bend the rules. But training had its grip on him. "I understand this is difficult, sir, but my instructions are very clear. Only guests on the approved list may enter." Around us, other guests flowed past with effortless ease, their names checked and approved in seconds. Some slowed, curious, their eyes flicking toward me. I caught the subtle murmur of whispers, just loud enough to sting. "Perhaps if you called the wedding planner," I suggested, forcing my voice to remain calm, my dignity intact. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir. The ceremony has already begun." And there it was, the sharp burn of humiliation. Not behind closed doors, not quietly, but here in the grand lobby of a hotel to which I had personally donated hundreds of thousands of dollars. The plaza. My plaza was refusing me entry to my own daughter's wedding. I stepped aside, my jaw tight, and reached into my jacket for my phone. My thumb found the familiar speed dial. "Bill, it's George," I said when he answered. "I'm in your lobby, and there seems to be a misunderstanding about my access to the Morrison Hartwell wedding." "Give me 30 seconds," he said without hesitation. True to his word, Bill Patterson appeared almost immediately, emerging from a side hallway with the confident stride of a man who had solved problems for decades. Mid-50s, silver hair, perfectly combed navy suit, pressed to perfection. He radiated the cool competence that made the plaza legendary. "Mr. Hartwell," he said warmly, "my sincere apologies. Please follow me." With a discreet gesture, he guided me away from the main guest flow, leading me down a quiet service corridor marked "Hotel Personnel Only." The hum of the wedding chatter faded behind us, replaced by the low thrum of hidden machinery and the muffled echoes of footsteps on polished tile. I was inside, but not as I had imagined. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, an elegant sleight of hand by the plaza's architecture. One moment we were gliding across gleaming marble floors under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, the air faintly scented with orchids and expensive perfume. The next, the marble faded into a muted practical carpet, and the chandeliers gave way to rows of unobtrusive ceiling lights. The public face of opulence had dissolved into the quiet machinery that kept it all running. Bill walked beside me, his voice low and measured. "I understand this is a delicate family situation," he murmured, glancing at me with the faintest suggestion of concern. "We'll get you inside without any further complications." We moved deeper into the plaza's working heart, the hum of air vents and the faint metallic clatter of service carts replacing the elegant string quartet. The service hallway opened into the commercial kitchen, a vast high-ceilinged hive of activity. The air was alive with the sizzle of skillets, the rhythmic thud of knives on cutting boards, and the aromatic mingling of butter, rosemary, and roasting meats. In one corner, a team of pastry chefs was putting the finishing touches on a wedding cake that looked less like dessert and more like sculpture. A four-tiered masterpiece iced in smooth white fondant, adorned with delicate sugar roses, so lifelike they might have been plucked from a garden. I estimated without exaggeration that it cost more than the average person's car. The kitchen staff moved with the swift precision of a well-rehearsed ballet, each motion purposeful, each glance brief but curious. Some noticed me, the man in the tailored suit with the kind of watch you don't see in shop windows, being escorted through their domain. But Bill's presence was a silent passport. Those who recognized him simply nodded respectfully as we passed. "The ceremony should be concluding momentarily," Bill explained in a tone that balanced efficiency with discretion. "I'll position you near the service entrance to the grand ballroom. You'll have a clear view, but you can exit quickly if needed." We stopped before an unassuming door tucked between a linen storage closet and a row of catering carts. A simple plaque read, "Ballroom Service." Bill's hand hovered over the handle, his eyes searching mine. "Mr. Hartwell," he said carefully, "are you certain about this approach? I could arrange a more conventional meeting with your daughter after the ceremony." I let out a slow breath. "I've tried conventional, Bill. This is my last chance to see if I was right about her choice." He studied me for a moment longer, then gave a single understanding nod. The handle turned, and with a soft push, the door swung open. The sight stole my breath. The grand ballroom stretched before me like a vision from a dream. Hundreds of flickering candles floated among towering floral arrangements, roses, hydrangeas, and orchids in pale creams and blush pinks. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, their reflections dancing off champagne flutes and polished silverware. A live orchestra tucked neatly along one side of the room wove a soft, romantic thread of music through the air. 200 guests draped in elegance sat wrapped in their seats, and at the far end, under an arch laced with white roses and baby's breath, stood Nancy, my daughter. She was radiant, her gown a cascade of satin and lace, her veil catching the light like a halo. Her hand rested lightly in Rick's, her posture straight, but unforced, her smile so natural it was almost blinding. Even from the periphery, even from this hidden doorway, I could see it. She wasn't just happy, she was certain. The officiant's voice carried clearly through the room. "You may now kiss the bride." My chest tightened, not from anger, not from pride, but from the crushing weight of knowing that whatever happened next, nothing would ever quite be the same. The crowd had begun to close in, not aggressively, but with that magnetic pull that only drama can create. Sequined gowns brushed against tailored tuxedos, the air thick with perfumed champagne, and the subtle static of anticipation. One by one, smartphones emerged from diamond-encrusted clutches and silk-lined pockets, their cameras ready. In this age of instant sharing, no one wanted to miss a front-row seat to the unfolding spectacle. Rick straightened his posture, sensing his chance to frame the narrative before anyone else could. "Just the help, really," he said, his voice pitched for the audience rather than for me. His smile was smug, his tone dripping with patronizing confidence. "Some people don't understand boundaries." And then crash. The sharp, crystalline sound of shattering glass cut through the noise like a gunshot. Conversations halted. Even the laughter from the far end of the ballroom died mid-breath. Michael Steinberg, a silver-haired man in a midnight blue tuxedo, stood stock still, his arm frozen mid-air, where he'd been holding a champagne flute moments earlier. The jagged remains of crystal lay at his feet, the pale gold liquid, spreading across the marble in a shimmering puddle. But Michael wasn't looking at the mess. He was looking at me. I saw the recognition flicker in his eyes, first a flash of uncertainty, then disbelief, and finally certainty. His lips parted. "Oh my God," he whispered as though the words had escaped before he could stop them, and then louder for the entire room to hear George Harrison. From Nurok. The effect was immediate. Rick's expression faltered, his brow knitting in confusion. What he demanded, whipping his head toward Michael. But Michael was already fumbling for his phone, his hands trembling in a way that suggested awe rather than clumsiness. He scrolled quickly, eyes darting between the screen and my face. Then he turned the display toward the nearest onlookers, his voice carrying across the hushed ballroom Forbes magazine. Tech Visionary of the Year. George Harrison, founder and CEO of Neurosh AI. Net worth, $2.3 billion. A ripple of noise swept through the crowd. It was soft at first, like a breeze through tall grass, but it built rapidly, murmurs, gasps, the low hum of verification, as more and more guests pulled out their own phones, their screens glowing with search results. My Forbes cover photo began appearing in hands all around the room. "That's impossible," Rick blurted, his face draining of color. "He's a plumber. He drives a beat-up Toyota. He lives in Brooklyn." I let the silence stretch for just a heartbeat, savoring the moment before replying evenly. "And a penthouse that overlooks the bridge I crossed to visit your family's home 3 weeks ago." The crunch of broken glass punctuated my words as Michael stepped forward, his polished shoe grinding against the shards. He held his phone out toward me now, the glossy magazine cover staring back at us both, my face framed by the bold headline, "The Artificial Intelligence Pioneer Who Revolutionized Predictive Analytics." Holy, Michael caught himself, then shook his head slowly. "You're actually here." Rick's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. Around us, the scene had transformed into a social media feeding frenzy. Guests were showing each other their screens, whispering confirmations, angling their cameras for the best shot. Videos were already being recorded. I could see the little red circles blinking on their devices. The elegant wedding reception was no longer about champagne toasts and polite congratulations. It had become something far juicier, a public unmasking. This can't," Rick's voice cracked. His hand twitched as he reached out toward me, desperation replacing arrogance. "Please, Mr. Harrison, sir, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." I stepped back just enough to make it clear that no contact would be made. My voice was calm, deliberate, and unshakable. "No misunderstanding, Rick. You showed me exactly who you are." I let my eyes sweep over the crowd, ensuring they were all listening. The only question now is whether Nancy sees it too. The intensity in the room was electric. People were abandoning conversations mid-sentence to gather closer. Even the string quartet had slowed their bows, moving more delicately over the strings, as if unwilling to intrude on the unfolding drama. Every gaze was locked on us, waiting to see what would happen next. Rick's knees hit the polished marble with a dull, echoing thud. The sound was swallowed by the vastness of the ballroom, but the sight was unforgettable. He was surrounded by the glittering remnants of Michael's shattered champagne flute, the shards catching the light from the chandeliers above. They looked almost beautiful, scattered like fallen stars around a man whose own star was imploding in real time. Please, his voice cracked on the word desperation, bleeding through the edges. I didn't know. If I had known who you were, he swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. If I had known you were wealthy, you would have been treated with the respect you deserved. A ripple of gas moved through the onlookers. He didn't even hear himself. The confession was damning enough to silence an entire ballroom. I didn't need to shout. My voice carried across the polished expanse, steady cold final. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. From the far side of the room, movement caught my eye. Nancy. Her wedding gown trailed behind her in soft waves of ivory and lace as she pushed through the throng of guests. She didn't run. Nancy was too well trained in appearances for that, but her steps were urgent. Heads turned as she passed the air, thick with whispers. Michael Steinberg, still standing like a sentinel, held his tablet aloft. Its screen glowed bright in the dim light, displaying my Forbes profile in full color. My face stared back at the crowd, confident, composed, a sharp contrast to the humble facade I had worn to their dinner weeks ago. Look at this, Michael's voice rang out. George Harrison, founder of Neuralink, the AI visionary who transformed predictive analytics. Net worth, $2.3 billion. Phones emerged from every direction, glowing rectangles rising like fireflies in the night. Fingers tapped feverishly as the room erupted into a flurry of Google searches. The hum of digital verification spread like wildfire, soft at first, then louder with each confirmation. Here's another article: a woman draped in diamonds announced, reading from her screen, as though narrating the fall of an empire. Harrison's charitable foundation donates $50 million annually to education initiatives. And this one, a man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, added, his voice heavy with awe. Neuralink stock hits an all-time high under Harrison's leadership. Rick stayed frozen on the floor, surrounded by glass and scandal. His face cycled through denial, shock, and a creeping horror that settled into the lines around his eyes. The meticulously curated perfection of his wedding was unraveling before him like a thread pulled from a silk sleeve. This is impossible. His voice trembled, but in the hush that had fallen, everyone heard it. You wore a Target suit. You drove a beat-up car. You said you were a plumber. I met his gaze, unflinching. I never said I was poor Rick. You assumed that because of how I looked. I adjusted my Patek Philippe watch, an unconscious habit, but the small glint of gold caught the eyes of several guests, their murmurs rising again. You treated me with contempt because you thought I couldn't help your career. The crowd pressed closer now, their phones raised high, capturing every word and every twitch of Rick's face. In the digital age, this wasn't just public humiliation. It was the kind of viral moment that could end a career in hours. Please. Rick scrambled awkwardly to his feet, nearly slipping on the champagne spill. He reached for my hands, his own trembling. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. But the apologies weren't for me anymore. They were for the dozens of lenses trained on him, for the tidal wave of judgment that was about to crash down once the videos hit the internet. And behind him, Nancy was almost close enough to hear every word. If I had known, Rick choked out, his voice trembling, you would have kissed my feet. I stepped back, avoiding his grasp. My eyes locked on his. The same way you're doing now. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. People shifted, drawn in by the gravitational pull of scandal. From the far edge of the circle, Mary and Tom Morrison appeared, their expressions ashen. They weren't simply embarrassed parents anymore. They were witnesses to the public disintegration of their son's reputation. Mary clutched her pearls like a talisman, her lips parting in disbelief. We didn't know, she whispered urgently to anyone who would listen, her voice pitched high with panic. We had no idea who he was, but whispers couldn't contain the damage anymore. It was spilling outward, unstoppable. Guests lifted their phones higher, angling for the best shot. The glowing screens reflected in champagne glasses as fingers flew across touchscreens. Videos were already hitting social media, captions forming in real time. Names were being tagged: colleagues, business partners, rivals. This wasn't a scandal contained to a ballroom. It was a contagion racing through the veins of the internet. 2.3 billion, someone repeated in the crowd, voice dripping with incredulity. And they treated him like the help, another voice added, bitter and sharp. At his own daughter's wedding came a third, this one loaded with disgust. Rick lunged forward again, his desperation naked now unmasked for all to see. His hands reached for my arm, but I stepped aside, leaving him grasping at air. "Mr. Harrison, sir, please," he begged, his voice breaking. "I love Nancy. I would never hurt her. This was all a misunderstanding." "No, Rick." I didn't raise my voice, but the quiet steel in my tone cut deeper than any shout could have. The words carried across the marble floor, clear and undeniable. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a character test, and you failed." The entire dynamic of the room had shifted. Where once there had been polite laughter and clinking glasses, there was now a charged stillness. The guests who moments before had been basking in the glow of champagne and small talk stood transfixed. They were no longer partygoers, they were witnesses to a reckoning. The man who had built his world on appearances was now being measured by his actions. And the verdict was unanimous. "Someone's coming," a voice murmured near the back. Heads turned. Through the parted sea of guests I saw her. Nancy. Her wedding gown floated behind her, in waves of satin and lace, the delicate beading, catching the light like frost. She moved with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble, each step a drumbeat of inevitability. At first her face was simply curious, but as her eyes found me standing at the center of the commotion, recognition began to dawn. That recognition deepened into something heavier, suspicion, perhaps even fear, as she took in the scene, her father, her fiancé, and the tightening ring of onlookers. "Dad." Her voice was soft, but carried effortlessly, slicing through the charged air like a blade through silk. The crowd fell utterly silent. Even the string quartet faltered, their music dissolving into stillness. Nancy stood at the very edge of the circle, her gown brushing the marble floor, her eyes flicking between Rick and me as though piecing together a puzzle whose edges were jagged and sharp. Something in the air told everyone that whatever came next would not be forgotten. Her new husband was on his knees. Shards of broken glass glittered across the polished marble floor like tiny fragments of a fallen crown. Guests stood in a wide circle, their faces caught between fascination and discomfort. Their phones raised high, each glowing screen, displaying the same thing, my Forbes profile. And there I was standing calmly at the center of it all, my hands folded loosely in front of me, the eye of a social storm. "Dad, what are you doing here?" Nancy's voice was small, almost tentative, but there was no anger in it, only confusion. I turned toward her. My daughter, radiant in her wedding gown, looked like she had stepped out of a dream, the intricate lace catching the light, the veil trailing softly behind her. Even amid the chaos, she seemed ethereal, and in that instant my heart managed the impossible, breaking and healing all at once. "I came to see my daughter get married," I said simply. Even if she didn't want me here. Her eyes, so like her mother's, shimmered as understanding began to take hold. Her gaze dropped to the broken champagne flute at Rick's feet, then lifted again to the circle of guests holding their phones, each one displaying undeniable proof of who I was. "You're not a plumber," she breathed. "I never was, sweetheart." I allowed a faint smile. "I just wanted to see what kind of man you were marrying." The ballroom seemed to fold in on itself. Conversation ceased entirely. Even the faint clink of glasses at the bar stopped. All that could be heard was the gentle swish of Nancy's gown as she began walking toward me. Each step was deliberate, a quiet rebellion against the man still kneeling in humiliation behind her. "I'm so sorry, Dad." Her words came out in a rush, carried on a shaky breath. "I should have listened. I should have trusted your judgment." My arms opened without thought, and she fell into them, the delicate satin of her gown pressing between us. I could feel the tremble in her shoulders, the catch in her breath. "I love you," I whispered into her hair. "That's all that matters." Around us, the crowd seemed to exhale as one, a collective release of tension. Some dabbed at their eyes, phones lowered, shifting from recording confrontation to capturing a tender reunion. After holding her for a long moment, I pulled back just enough to look at her face. Then I glanced toward the wedding band. "May I borrow your microphone?" The band leader, reading the gravity of the moment, handed me the wireless mic without hesitation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice resonating in the hushed room, "thank you for sharing this important day with my daughter Nancy. Despite some complications, this is still her wedding day, and she deserves to celebrate. Applause rose gentle at first, then growing warmer. Nancy's fingers tightened around mine, tears still streaking her cheeks, but her smile now glowed brighter than any chandelier above us. I also want to set some new family ground rules. I continued, my eyes finding Rick, who had finally pushed himself to his feet. His tuxedo was rumpled, his face pale, and his eyes darted between me and the guests. Nancy has chosen to marry Rick Morrison, and I respect her decision, I said evenly. However, from this day forward, Mr. Morrison and I will maintain a strictly professional relationship. Rick nodded rapidly, his Adam's apple bobbing. He understood I was offering him survival, not forgiveness. Nancy will always be welcome in my home, I added. Her husband will be tolerated when necessary, but only because Nancy loves him. A ripple of knowing murmurs moved through the crowd. I let the pause stretch just long enough. Are we clear on these terms? Yes, sir, Rick mumbled barely above a whisper. Satisfied, I handed the microphone back to the bandleader, then turned to Nancy with a softer smile. Now, would you honor me with a dance? I'd love to, Dad. As we stepped onto the dance floor, the tension in the room began to dissolve. Conversations resumed, the band eased into a gentle melody, and guests drifted back toward the buffet and bar. But I noticed the way their eyes lingered, not on the groom, but on us. A father and daughter reclaiming their bond in the middle of a wedding that had almost been stolen from them. The revelation was like a lightning strike in the middle of the ballroom, enough gossip fuel to keep New York's high society buzzing for months. Yet as the dust began to settle, there was something deeply satisfying in the way the chaos had resolved itself. Justice had been served, but it was wrapped in grace, and that combination left the guests with a sense of closure rather than bitterness. The orchestra, sensing the tension had reached its end, began to play a soft, lilting waltz. I extended my hand to Nancy. She placed hers in mine without hesitation, her fingers still trembling slightly. We stepped into the familiar rhythm, the same steps we had practiced in our living room when she was just 12, still small enough to stand on my shoes as I guided her around the floor. Back then, she had looked at me with the wide-eyed certainty that her father was the smartest man in the world. I really messed up, didn't I? She whispered, her eyes searching mine for reassurance. You fell in love, I replied, my voice warm but steady. That's not a mistake. I spun her gently, the silk of her dress fanning out in a perfect circle, catching the light like a halo. But maybe next time, I added with a soft smile, trust your old man's instincts about character. There won't be a next time, she said, half laughing through her tears. I'm married now. Yes, you are. I said, the weight of my words, holding both blessing and warning. And despite everything, I hope you'll be happy. From the edge of the dance floor, I caught sight of Rick. He was standing stiffly, his expression caught somewhere between humiliation and relief. His parents flanked him, their faces pale, not just from embarrassment, but from realizing their meticulously crafted social climb had collapsed in a single afternoon. They would survive. Families like theirs always did, but the landscape had changed forever. Rick would remain my son-in-law, but on terms he never could have imagined. Nancy's voice broke through my thoughts. Will you really let him come to family dinners if you want him there? Yes, I said, my tone deliberately measured. Then I let a grin slip through. But he'll sit at the children's table. Nancy's laughter rang out, pure, unguarded, and bright enough to draw smiles from those nearby. It was the first moment of unfiltered joy I'd seen from her all day, and it eased something heavy in my chest. Around us, the celebration slowly regained its momentum. Glasses clinked, laughter rose, and the band's music swelled. But the energy had shifted. The whispers in the corners were no longer about wealth or scandal. They were about family loyalty and how easily people reveal who they truly are when they think no one important is watching. Already phones were buzzing with notifications as the night's events spread across social media. Yes, the humiliation had been captured, replayed, and commented on, but now the videos focused less on the downfall and more on the reconciliation, the father and daughter finding each other again in the middle of the storm. The Plaza Hotel had hosted countless weddings over the decades, but I knew this one would be remembered long after the flowers wilted and the champagne bottles were emptied. Not for the opulence or the guest list, but for the quiet truth that had unfolded before everyone's eyes. True class has nothing to do with bank account balances and everything to do with integrity. As the waltz came to its gentle conclusion, I pressed a kiss to Nancy's forehead. Welcome to married life, sweetheart. Just remember, if he ever treats you badly, you know where to find me. Her eyes softened. I love you, Dad. I love you too. I released her hand with a smile. Now go enjoy your reception. You only get one wedding day. She returned to Rick, who took her hand like a man clutching a lifeline. His relief was obvious, but so was his understanding the ground rules had been set and they would not be broken. The night continued. Champagne flowed, the band played, and laughter filled the room. But beneath the surface, the power dynamics had shifted permanently. And somewhere in the quiet space of my heart, I knew Elizabeth Nancy's mother would have been proud.